Hi guys, my name is Anna Smallwood and I am a PhD graduate from Dr. Yu's lab from December of 2020. And I'm going to give a brief overview, kind of a short video on how to prepare a PhD thesis and defense. This is how I prepared my thesis and defense, and I'll share some of my tips with you. I know in Dr. Yu's lab there weren't any graduate students who were like above me in lab since I joined. So I had to figure out a lot of this on my own, so I'm going to share it through this video, so even after I have graduated this December, you guys will have kind of a guide to go by. So I'm just going to break it down into two sections. The first is how to prepare and format the written thesis, which probably is the most time consuming, and then number two is how to prepare your defense presentation. So I'll go ahead and use my own thesis as an example here. Which you can actually just access through RPI, I'm pretty sure, if you want to read it. But I'm mostly going to talk about kind of formatting and how I spent the time to really think how I wanted to form my story of my thesis. So we'll start with formatting just because this information, in my opinion, is the best to know from the very beginning, so you don't have to make a ton of corrections later. The Office of Graduate Education is very strict about how these theses need to be formatted. So they offer both a LaTeX and Word template. The document I'm showing you now is in the Word template, and it makes writing these so much easier than if you would do it yourself. So I highly recommend you download those from the OGE site, and you use them depending if you're a coding person or not. I hear the LaTeX one is fine too, but I just chose to use the Word one. However, these templates are not perfect. You will find some errors here and there, especially depending on the length of your thesis and also the material that's in your thesis. So people with a lot of math might run into some problems just with how the equations are formatted. That's just something that I've heard in passing from friends who work with the templates as well as I do. I fortunately didn't have a ton of math in mine, so I didn't run into that, but basically, don't think the template is always right. You definitely want to double check yourself. There's also a handbook online on the same OGE website that will give you kind of a checklist of your formatting things. So it'll be, for example, your document is either in Times New Roman or Arial, and you can check that off. Your document is in size 12 font, and you can check that off. So definitely utilize their resources. They're also extremely helpful if you want to reach out with any questions. I reached out really early, I submitted my thesis in November of 2020, and I reached out in like March of 2020 just to like make a connection with them, and also go to some of their workshops, their virtual workshops on how to prepare the thesis so you don't get held up in the formal review at the end of your degree when you want to be relaxing. So yeah, we'll go over just brief formatting because a lot of this you can find online. When you are formatting, consistency is key when it comes to how things are set up. So, for example, oops, there we go. So let me see if I can show you some multiple pages at a time. There we go. So you'll see that everything's double spaced. If you, for example, consistency would be a good example of if the body of your text is in Times New Roman, you want your captions to be in Times New Roman, for example. You want all of your body text to be the same font, same margins, etc. That's really important. So this is why it's a really good idea to use the OGE template, because it will do that for you. So the one thing that I noticed that was a little tricky, when you're building this table of contents, Word has this really nice tool where you can go to references, and there is a table of contents tool, and it will build a table of contents for you based on the headers of each section. So to do that, for example, these, I'll go past the front matter and get here. So the number ones, or the first section would be introduction, and then the subsection would be this 1.1 and then my title. You can add those headings by giving them these properties here. So highlighting your text and then choosing heading 1, which would be like what I showed you with introduction. Heading 2 would be a subsection. Heading 3 would be a subsection, so on and so forth. And you can build your table of contents that way using that tool. There's a lot of information about that online, but don't try to build it yourself because you'll waste time. Just use the tool. It's really, really easy once you get the hang of it. The same thing goes for your list of tables and list of figures. There is under references, there's also an insert table of figures tool, which works the same way. So if you go to your figures, for example, this is my first figure. Down here, what I did is I did insert caption. And then in that box, I was able to put this caption. And then once I went back up so I do that to all my figures, and then when I created my list of figures, it already included all my captions in this nice little table of contents, which is great too, because if it switches pages from you double spacing or something, like your document gets longer or you're editing, the page numbers will be updated. So if you just go here and update your list of figures again, it'll update automatically. So that's really handy. Definitely take advantage of those tools. The same thing goes for list of tables. The only difference is it's table instead of figure, but they're both under this tool. So those 3 tools really saved a lot of time for me, because when you're writing your dissertation, the last thing you want to do is focus on these kind of mindless tasks when you should really be like writing the bulk of the material. So definitely take advantage of the tools. So other than that, let me look at my list here. So as for the dissertation itself, let's go to my table of contents again. For me, I think, and probably for most people, 3 main chapters of experimental material that you wrote is probably sufficient, and that does not include your intro or your conclusion or concluding remarks section. So for me, I have 1, 2, 3, which corresponds to chapters 2, 3, and 4. You could even do, I originally think I had 4 chapters, but I ended up combining 2 of them into this one, which is why it's really long. So 3 to 4 chapters in the middle is probably sufficient. And then your introduction obviously is kind of like a literature review. So there's really 2 different ways you can do this. And there's one way that our lab prefers. So you can write it as like kind of in the order of what you did, chapter by chapter, or the really, really smart way to do it is to write each chapter as its own self-contained manuscript, because that's not only great if you already have papers published where you can just put it in and publish it in your dissertation, but if you are going to have papers published after you graduate, which a lot of people do, it makes things really easy for you and your advisor to just edit the chapter you already have, because it's already formatted as a manuscript, and then submit it that way. So that's how I formatted mine. So I have these 3 standalone chapters which are already in the format of a manuscript, regardless of whether or not we actually do publish them. It just made things a lot easier. It kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone. So I would highly recommend doing that. I'm pretty sure Dr. Yu would also highly recommend you do that as well. So that's kind of my 2 cents on that. As for the dissertation itself, generally speaking, you're going to have, I would say, probably 50 figures. Mine are kind of labeled, more than 50 figures actually. Mine are labeled by chapter, and you're going to have both tables and figures. Obviously, these are going to fit into your manuscript format like I just discussed. And then basically, if you can use those figures as an outline for the rest of your writing, your life is going to be made a lot easier. So that's what I would recommend there. Have your figures prepared first, which you will probably have prepared over the course of your PhD, and then make them your outline. And you know what you need to write about, and you know how the story for each of your chapters is going to go. So that being said, let me see if I want to talk a little bit. Yeah, I think I want to talk a little bit about references here. So you have all your chapters. They're all kind of formatted here. This is what they'll look like. We get all the way down to references. So references can be super, super tricky because the Office of Graduate Education, when they do the formal review of your dissertation, they will go through every reference and make sure it is formatted appropriately. All references need to be in American Chemical Society format, or ACS. And you can use a reference manager. My favorite is Mendeley. I really like it. It's free online, and it's really straightforward and easy to use. Other options would be Zotero or EndNote. EndNote Online is also available, and you can use these in conjunction with some databases like Web of Science and Google Scholar. So they make life a lot easier. However, when they spit out the references for you, they're not always correct, and sometimes they're in the wrong style. So what you really need to do, and what is kind of time consuming, is you want to build your bibliography from Mendeley or whatever you're using, and go through each source and make sure it is formatted correctly. Otherwise, you're going to get held up at formal review, which is not really something you want to do, considering that's the time you want to relax once you've submitted your dissertation. But you need to go through each one and make sure it's correct. So otherwise, OGE is going to give you like you need to fix this. You need to put you need to put an author here. You need to put a year here. But I find that most of the time, Mendeley especially is usually correct. So it's not too bad. So that's what I'll say for references. Just keep that in mind. You might have 100 references. You might have 300 references. Just keep in mind that the formatting of them is going to be very important, so it's clear as to what you're referring to. Other than that, I guess I would say, like I said before, your introduction really should be a literature review, and it should go from broad information at the beginning into narrow information at the end, kind of like the introduction of just like a journal article, but obviously it's going to be a lot longer. And you want to focus in on your particular overview of what goals you're trying to achieve with your dissertation. So we'll go up to my intro. And you can include figures in your intro. They can also be from other papers, but you have to cite them properly and get permission to reproduce them as well. So just keep that in mind. So for example, my project was on 3D printing. So I start really broad with 3D printing. And I kind of narrow in on the types of technologies, and then specifically stereolithography, and then I go into the materials in stereolithography, applications, and then depth of cure, which is my main point of my entire dissertation. And that's kind of where I'm zeroing in. I have like this nice schematic that talks about what I'm trying to convey to the reader, and then I go into a brief overview of the series of studies that I'm presenting. So yeah, you can format this kind of like a literature review, but you definitely want to go like the upside down triangle route, which is broad information to narrow information. I'm not going to go into the individual chapters so much because I said usually for Dr. Yu's lab, what we want to do is kind of format them like a manuscript, and most of us know how a manuscript is formatted. So usually introduction, experimental, and then a results and discussion section right here. And then you'll go through that with all your data, and you'll tie it up into a nice package. And then you will have a short conclusion section, which ties everything together at the end. And you can do that for all of your chapters. And you see, I just move into the next chapter after that one. So I'll also talk about the concluding remarks chapter, because I was a little unclear on that one as well when I was writing. So your concluding remarks section, you don't need any like images or anything. You don't need any figures. You just want to talk about what did we cover in each chapter? Why is it important? And then tie it together maybe in like a page or a short set of paragraphs as to how this affects science as a whole, like basically this original research, what is it contributing to the world of chemistry, the world of science in general. So it's a nice tie together at the very end, but also gives a nice summary of what you talked about. So that's an overview of the written dissertation portion. I'll get a little bit into the presentation now, because I think the dissertation from person to person is really, it depends on your projects. It really depends on how it's laid out, but this gives you like the general format and the general overview of how you're really supposed to write this thing. So I'll get into my presentation a little bit. I made another video about candidacy exams. I started working on my dissertation well before my defense. Probably started writing it in April of 2020 and defended in November of 2020. And that was like getting up and contributing to it a little bit each day. It actually helped a lot that this was during quarantine for the COVID-19 pandemic, and that gave me a lot of time to really focus on my writing. But once I finished my dissertation, I was able to write or construct a nice PowerPoint presentation over the course of a few weeks with some of Dr. Yu's feedback as well. So your dissertation will give you a really nice outline, a really detailed outline of what you should present. That being said, your defense presentation should be like 45 to 60 minutes long, so you will not have time to present your entire dissertation. I had 3 main chapters, and I chose to present 2 of them in the interest of time, which is totally fine. Depending on how many chapters you have, just pick the ones that probably form the best story, or the ones that you found the most interesting. And this is something you should talk to Dr. Yu about as well, to see, what he thinks fits together best and kind of to help you with your own opinions of your work. So this was actually done virtually, so I did my defense over WebEx, so that's why I have this "please remain muted" notice on here. Since this is a longer presentation, mine was about 55 minutes. I do have a presentation overview, and I don't recommend doing this for short presentations, like 15 to 20 minutes, just because you need to kind of like cram everything in, because that's a really short amount of time to speak. But it's nice to remind people of, as we're going through the presentation, at what point are we at, and how close are we to the end, or how much longer do we have, so I always put an overview. So I started with an introduction with 3 main points from my intro section, which is going broad to narrow information, 2 main chapters, and then I have conclusions at the end. So as for my intro slides, I have a lot of like really broad information about, for example, 3D printing versus injection molding. Why do we like 3D printing better in this context? Lots of colorful images that don't necessarily come from a scientific source. So for example, you can find some nice pictures of like 3D printed objects online. You just have to make sure you cite them. This one was taken from the Adidas website for their new 3D printed shoe. And again, here we have some nice colorful images that are really nice for your audience to look at. When you do get into images from papers, like from manuscripts, so scientific peer-reviewed articles, I recommend, just like I do for candidacy, putting them in the bottom right, because not only does that help you remember where this information is from, but it also, your committee will look at it and maybe recognize the author, recognize the paper, and it will kind of give some almost backup to what claims you're trying to assert. That's a little more important during candidacy, but I would recommend doing it to some degree for your defense as well. These are actually videos. I would recommend putting videos in if you can, or if you're working with a system that is cool to watch, or a video would help the audience understand how it works better. Definitely put a video in. You can download them from YouTube into MP4 format and then just paste them right into your presentation. This one I actually took myself with my phone, which is even easier. You literally can just like email it to yourself and put it in. So that's something to keep in mind. And Dr. Yu loves videos and presentations. It just makes the presentation more interesting and fun. Again, I don't like to put a lot of text in my intro slides. I like to kind of look at a picture and know what I'm going to say. And it's also easier for the audience to really look and see and be interested instead of reading through a ton of text. So this is all for intro stuff. Of course, I talked about the COVID-19 pandemic because 3D printing was kind of at the forefront of the news during that. I get into explaining my system. So again, we're going from really broad information to really narrow information. My system still, and then my hypothesis slide. So this is kind of like, why am I doing this? What's important about this? And then kind of an outro for my intro slide of, here are some examples of what I'm trying to do in nature. And why do we like them? Because they work well and nature produces them, so we should be able to produce them too. So after I get through my intro, I do talk about, I give an overview of the dissertation itself. This is mostly for my committee's benefit. If they have read it a while back, like for example, if you submitted it 2 weeks before and they read it right when you submitted it, they may not have read it immediately before your presentation. So this gives them a reminder on how the chapters were set up. So I also used this as a barrier slide to show what I was going to talk about. So I said, oh, in the interest of time, these 2 chapters are what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to focus on this one first, and then I get right into that chapter. So when it comes to presenting your chapters, I think one of the best pieces of advice Dr. Yu gave me is start out with your most interesting data, even if it isn't in the chronological order. So for me, this plot with mechanical properties was the most interesting data from this study. I talk about it and then I say, okay, how did we get here? What were our methods? And then I go into it from there. So I explain myself here. We go into some data that I'm using, what makes up my system, kind of give some background, and then I get into my real data. And you'll notice that when I get to here, I show this data again with more supporting data. And that's a really effective way to present not only for defense, but in general, because you catch the audience's attention with this really interesting data. And then they're invested and want to know, what did you do to get this? Like, how did you get this interesting data? So that's something to keep in mind. There's a bunch of different ways you can format your chapter presentations, and they might not be in chronological order, and that's okay. So more data, but then I end this section on kind of with a bang, with a schematic to kind of be like, all right, we're condensing everything down into this easy to understand schematic, which hopefully gives the audience like a, oh, okay moment where they're just like, this makes sense. Like, you know, this is easy for me to understand even without a scientific background, and I get it. And that's a good point to conclude on. So I did 2 chapters, like I said. I kind of did the same thing for the second chapter, so I won't get too much into that. But I did show for the second chapter a lot of scanning electron microscopy. So microscopy or high-resolution images. Dr. Yu suggested that I blow these up to full slide size, and I agree with that because it helps us to really see what we're trying to look for. We don't have to make them small and like in line on the slide. So if you ever have images or something that's like interesting or fun data like microscopy data, you can definitely blow it up really big. Okay, so I give the conclusion for that chapter, which I did for the other one as well. And then I give an overall conclusion, and that's kind of the end of the defense. So you don't actually need to get into like a really in-depth concluding remarks in your presentation like you do in your thesis, which, I mean, the concluding chapter can be anywhere from like 1 to 10 pages. I think mine was like 5. So you can just take some major points from each of the chapters you presented and put it in your overall conclusions so that the audience realizes, once again, why are you doing this? Why is it important? Why is it new? Why do we like it? So definitely put that in as a concluder so that they're kind of brought to the main point from the beginning, which is, oh, we want to take these lessons from nature. Like for me, it was, we want to take these lessons from nature, tuning morphologies on the nano and micro scale to get new novel materials with improved mechanical properties, and the audience will be reminded of that, and they'll feel satisfied when you end your presentation as opposed to feeling confused. So, of course, you always want an acknowledgement slide at the end with your funding source and all the other people who helped you during your PhD. So I would recommend, now that I've shown you kind of what an outline of what these look like, I would recommend A, watch as many public defenses as you can. I was only able to watch 1 virtual defense before I presented. I've watched a bunch in person, but doing the virtual defense, it was a little overwhelming or intimidating because I'd never done it and I've only seen 1 other person do it. So try to see as many defenses as you can, even from your first year, because it'll help you feel better and more comfortable about it when you get to that point. I also recommend always stay in touch with Dr. Yu about your thoughts. And if you are confused about something or you need an outside opinion, just set up in a meeting with him and say, oh, you know, what do you think about this? Like for me, when I was setting up my dissertation chapters, I was like, here's how I want to set the chapters up. I think they flow really well. And I just met with him for 30 minutes and we kind of went through it and I gave my rationale and he suggested some changes like, oh, maybe you can combine these 2 chapters, make things easier, or maybe this will make a better story. And then just always keep in touch with him. He's always willing to help. He's available. And you're not like 100% on your own with this. So definitely keep the line of communication open. Other graduate students obviously also will be a huge help here, is especially if you're presenting, you don't want to come across as being like too confusing, or, you know, you don't want your audience to be like, oh, I don't care what this person's talking about because you're presenting it badly. And if you can get honest feedback from someone in your lab, that's really helpful as well. They can tell you straight up, okay, I think you're being boring, or I think you're too confusing here. And that will be very helpful as well. So like I said, I showed you my original thesis and presentation. The thesis should be available through RPI, and then Dr. Yu has a separate video on that's actually my defense presentation that you're welcome to watch. I graduate December 31st of 2020, but if you have any questions about these videos, you can talk to Dr. Yu, or you can contact me at my permanent email address, which is this. And just put the subject header as something, and I'm happy to answer. I'll be in touch with the lab for a while, so you're free to contact me if you would like with any questions. So hopefully that was informative and a just nice overview of how to set up your dissertation. And of course, keep the line of communication open with Dr. Yu, but also keep the line of communication open with the Office of Graduate Education, because they can be very helpful for writing. And finally, another important part is if you do need help with from your committee, they will be happy to help as well. So reach out to them if you need feedback, or if you need, thoughts on something, but your advisor will definitely be your lifeline for most of this. All right. Thank you for your attention.